Hello everyone, and welcome to this overview of Chapter 16, Section 3. If you remember, what we've been talking about in Chapter 16 is the nature of royal power in Europe during the 1600s and 1700s. And so far we've looked at a couple different countries, which I'll point out on a map in just a second. Before we get there, one of the things I wanted to point out is that in this section we will be talking about Prussia, and we'll be talking about the ruling family or the dynasty of Prussia. And I want to make sure everybody is clear that you should not confuse Prussia and the country of Russia. I know it looks confusing, it sounds confusing. Keep in mind that the two sound similar in English, but any similarity is purely coincidental. They are not the same country. They are not related. Two different language groups, two different sets of religions and customs, and two different dynasties. So different people altogether. So just keep that in mind as we're moving in. Now let's take a look at this map. Which this is a map of Europe in the year 1700, and gives you a little overview of some of the things that we've talked about so far. Again, remember in section 1 of this chapter we were looking at the country of France and the establishment of the Bourbon dynasty. Remember the Louis XIII, Louis XIV, actually starting with Henry IV as the founder of that dynasty. So we took a look at what had happened to government power there. In section 2 we have moved over here and we were looking at Russia and the Romanov dynasty. So again, we had talked about especially Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. One thing to notice is that on this map, this is prior to Catherine the Great's rule. So those ports that we talked about that were so important to them on the Black Sea, they're not there yet because, again, Catherine hadn't gotten that land yet. So in this section, we're interested in Prussia. And it's not labeled on this map, but Prussia was part originally of the Holy Roman Empire, and it is this kind of weird, sickly, orangish color. Okay, so you'll see that there's part of Prussia here, and then there's part of Prussia again over here, right, divided by a big chunk of Poland. So again, this is in 1700, so this is during the reign of the first of the monarchs that we want to talk about now. Before we get to him, though, just a quick side note. When we were talking about France, and one of the things we spoke about was the War of Spanish Succession. Remember, the Habsburg dynasty had died out in Spain, and the heir to that throne was actually a member of France's Bourbon dynasty, and so we had a war being fought because other countries were nervous about Spain being ruled by a Bourbon, and that maybe these two countries could be combined. Maybe looking at this map and seeing that, you might see why that fear would be there. I mean, these are two very large countries, so if these two were combined under one throne, obviously that could spell trouble for a lot of people. Coming out of that war, remember, with the Treaty of Utrecht, we spoke about some general provisions in that settlement, and one of the things I didn't point out and didn't really draw your attention to that the book did say was that there were two brand new dynasties that were recognized by the rest of Europe as a result of this war, and one of those was the Hohenzollern dynasty up here in Prussia. So coming out of that, Prussia is officially recognized as a kingdom, and we have the first Frederick is crowned as the king or the ruler of Prussia. Okay. The other dynasty, as a side note, is the Savoy dynasty down here in Sardinia, which we'll be talking about more in coming months. So now back to our Hohenzollerns, to the Prussians. As I said, Frederick I, he's the first one. We really don't need to focus on him. He's not somebody that we're going to be talking about. First of the dynasty that we want to talk about is this guy. This is Frederick William I. Chose this portrait for a reason, because I want you to look at the way he's choosing to be shown here, because it'll give you some ideas about what you need to remember as far as this ruler goes. He clearly is large and in charge here. He wants people to know that he's the ruler. He's got the symbols of office that he's holding. He's got this ermine cape, which again was traditionally reserved for kings. But also you'll notice that underneath the cape, he's got this uniform on, this armor. He knows where his strength is coming from. Now, two things that I would want to remember with him specifically are that, first of all, he's a good example of a ruler who was autocratic. Now, this is just another vocab term for you that means it's an idea you're already familiar with. If we take that, first of all, the suffix kratic, in Greek, krasi means rule, and when you put auto in front of that, it's self-rule. So this guy, he was it. He doesn't have to ask anybody's permission. He doesn't have to go to anybody for laws or things like that. He was running the country, and he wanted everybody to know that. Okay? Now, the second thing to remember about him is that he understood that Prussia's future strength would be really predicated on its military. And he is the first of Prussia's rulers that is really truly militaristic. And militarism is where you, as a nation, are focusing as much of your money, as much of your resources as you can on the military. You're glorifying it. You're getting people to join it. You're building up its strength. You're using it as a symbol. And in the case of Frederick William I, that's definitely pretty appropriate, because with as much money and as attention as he spends for decades building up this military, he barely used it. Very, very few conflicts during his reign, partly because he didn't really need to. He's using this military sort of as a threat. As an example of that, as an example of using the military as a visual threat, one of the things that he was known for around Europe was the formation of a special unit, a special regiment within the Prussian army that became known as the Potsdam Guards. Potsdam is a city in Prussia. This is the Potsdam Guard. They were all men. The minimum height to be a member of the Potsdam Guard was 6 feet. You had to be at least 6 feet, which 6 feet in the late 1600s in Europe was giant. And these people would have towered over everybody else. So think about what he's doing here. By surrounding himself by these soldiers who are just towering over everybody else, there's a real visual symbol here as he's traveling around and meeting with other rulers, and he's got these guys traveling with him that just definitely stand out in a crowd. He went out of his way to gather as many of these tall men as he could, not just from his own lands, which he did. He offered bonuses to parents who would turn over tall sons, or employers, turning over tall employees. He recruited in other countries, kidnapped when they had to. Other rulers would give him gifts of soldiers, that were exceptionally tall to be part of this Potsdam Guard. This particular portrait is actually, at the time, the most famous of the Potsdam Guard. He was actually Irish. His name was James Kirkland, and he was close to 7 feet tall. So he becomes sort of the poster boy for the Potsdam Guard in recruiting. Frederick William I was married to a woman named Sophie, and Sophie was the daughter of, his title was Elector. He was the Elector of Hanover. Hanover is another German-speaking kingdom that's right next door to Prussia. The reason why I'm mentioning this, just to show you how kind of weird some of these connections are, Sophie's father was a gentleman named George, so his title was the Elector of Hanover. And right at the end of the 1600s, beginnings of the 1700s, over in Great Britain, the Queen of Great Britain, her name was Anne. She was the last of the Stuart dynasty that we'll be talking about in another chapter here. She dies, and when she dies, she has no children of her own, so there's no heir to take over. So when the English start looking at the family tree and figuring out who's going to rule next, what they end up finding out is that the closest male relative to Anne was actually George, the Elector of Hanover. So he becomes the King of England. So by the time we get into the early 1700s, Frederick William I is the king of Prussia himself, and his father-in-law is now the king of England, which was good for Frederick William I because up until that point, England and Prussia didn't have a real great relationship. Now, back to Frederick and Sophie. Obviously, every king at this point in time who's interested in creating a dynasty is worried about longevity of that dynasty, survival. You got to have heirs. And they definitely worked hard on that because Frederick William I and Sophie had 14 children. Now, the oldest son, who ends up taking control when Frederick William I dies, was also named Frederick. Knock the William off, but he's Frederick, who you can see right here in his older age. He becomes, when he takes the throne, he becomes Frederick II. Okay, so he's the second king of Prussia named Frederick. And he ends up earning himself the nickname the Great, and we'll get to that in just a second. But a little bit about his childhood. When he was being raised, and as I said, Frederick was the oldest male. He wasn't the oldest child, but he was the oldest son that Frederick William I had. He was actually not his father's favorite. His father made no secret of the fact that he really didn't care for Frederick too much. Unfortunately for him, I guess, under Salic law, he didn't really have a choice. The oldest male has to inherit, so he's kind of stuck with Frederick. And I think part of the way he treats him is because of that. There's this resentment almost of not really liking this kid and knowing he's going to have to hand over power to him. So Frederick William decides that he's going to do everything he can to sort of whip this kid into shape and teach him, remember this militarism that we've been talking about over here. He wants to drum that into his head. So for instance, by age 2, Frederick is being woken up by a cannon every morning, as part of this military training. Age 6, Frederick was given his own regiment of other children that he had to drill and train and turn them into soldiers. Kind of a crazy upbringing. For his part, we know that Frederick wasn't real happy with this kind of childhood. The military was not his number one love. He was apparently a gifted musician. He was interested in art, history, a lot of other stuff. It wasn't just the military. At age 18, he decides he's had enough, and he actually tries to flee Prussia. He wants to get away from his father and everything. And a tutor of his, who was also a friend of his, helps Frederick, and the two of them are trying to escape, and they were caught before they managed to get out of Prussia. And they're dragged back to his father, and it comes out that they had planned on, when they got away, they were going to go to Great Britain. Now, this is before George becomes the King of England, so at this point, England and Prussia don't really get along very well. So the fact that Frederick was trying to flee to Great Britain is the chance that Frederick William has been waiting for. So he actually, the charge that he levels against his son and the tutor are treason, that they were actively trying to bring about the downfall of Prussia, which is crazy, but here's his chance to get rid of this son and pass it on to the son that he liked more. The tutor is put on trial first, and he was found guilty. And Frederick is forced to come in front row and center, sit and watch the execution. His friend is beheaded right before his eyes, which apparently had a pretty devastating effect on him, as you can imagine. He's put back in prison, and that's when the Holy Roman Emperor intervened. The Holy Roman Emperor said, look, you can't just go around killing heirs to thrones, so if you want to put Frederick on trial for treason, you have to do it in front of me, in front of the Holy Roman Emperor and the imperial court. At that point, Frederick William I decides he doesn't want to get involved in that, so Frederick is actually just basically let go. They dismiss the charges against him. That doesn't mean all is forgiven. Frederick was exiled from court. He wasn't allowed in the capital city, and his father proceeds to use the next 10 years to really continue, I guess, to make him miserable and try to drum these lessons into his head that he's been trying to get into him. About 10 years later, when Frederick turns 28, his father dies, and Frederick takes over. And Frederick becomes the ruler, and he's the king of Prussia for the next 46 years. So he's around quite a while. I mean, obviously you can see that this portrait right here is pretty clearly in his later years. But it also gives you an idea that he's a little different than his father. He is in a uniform here, but he's not shown like his father with all of this stuff on. We'll come back to the military piece in a second, but Frederick saw himself, you'll see I already put the term up there for you, Frederick saw himself as what we call an enlightened despot. And that term, first of all, despot, it's another way of saying an absolute ruler. I mean, there's no doubt that he was the one in charge of Prussia. He is not asking people's advice. He is not looking for approval. He was doing what he thought was best. But when we throw this word enlightened in front of it, we haven't gotten to it yet, but in another chapter here or so, we're going to talk about a movement going on in Europe at the time called the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, this new idea is developing, that kind of revolutionary, that, hey, maybe government actually exists to serve the people and not the other way around. So Frederick sees it as his duty, as an enlightened despot, he sees it as his duty to use that absolute power, but for the good of his people. So for instance, if you look at the textbook in this section, they'll point out some things that he does, some social programs, like some of the first public education in Europe, patronage of the arts, and music, theater, that kind of stuff. So he really does try to use his power, at least at some level, to help his people and to make their lives better. Beyond that, though, in terms of his importance for Prussia, definitely coming back to this idea of militarism. He may not have liked his father, may not have liked his upbringing, but he definitely learned that lesson that in the military, that's where your strength is. That's where the power, and that's Prussia's key to future success. So he continues to craft the Prussian army into this very polished, very professional fighting force. He does, one of the first things he does do is get rid of the Potsdam Guard, probably because he saw them as just too much of a symbol of his father and kind of useless. His father had never, the Potsdam Guard had never seen any action, never been used in battle, so they're just kind of this expensive group of 3,200 men who, by that point, he felt like weren't really doing much. So he dissolves the regiment and has them sprinkled throughout the rest of the army. But he's not afraid to use the army. And unlike his father, who, remember I just said Frederick William I didn't have any major wars that happened during his reign, the same is not true of Frederick II. Frederick II, kind of like when we talked about Louis XIV in France, Frederick II is involved in a lot of conflicts with his neighbors, a lot of wars. And those wars serve to expand Prussia's borders and expand Prussia's powers. Thanks to him, Prussia is on the road to becoming a real force to be reckoned with. And, spoiler alert here, months from now, when we get into the mid-1800s, late 1800s, we're going to talk about the formation of the first German state. There is no Germany at the time we're talking about yet. There's a lot of people who speak German, but they're all split up into lots of little different kingdoms. So later on, we'll be talking about the formation of the first Germany. And guess what family it is that crafts that first Germany? Yep. It's the Hohenzollerns. And again, a lot of that has to do with the work of rulers like Frederick the Great, who set Prussia on the road to becoming this military force that other people are going to need to be scared of. As just an example of the how that plays out or how that comes to be, the very first year of Frederick II's reign, he goes to war with Austria, and Austria, that's the Holy Roman Emperors. It's the Habsburg family. He goes to war with the Austrians, and he wins. So, for instance, if we go ahead and flip this map, and you can take a look. I know it kind of is confusing when you first look at it, but you can see that 1740 is the year that Frederick II took power. So we can see that anything that's shaded in this darker purple, this lighter purple, and this kind of bluish, those are all the lands that he inherited when he came to the throne. So, it's all this stuff around Berlin, this stuff, some of these scattered pieces down through here, and then again that chunk of East Prussia. That's all the land that he inherited. The land that's in green, like over here and over here and over here, these are all the chunks of land that he took while he was in control. And I mean, you can see he almost doubles the size of the country as its king. But the one I wanted to point out is this chunk down here, this province called Silesia. This is a result of that first war that I mentioned when he goes to war against Austria. Silesia was part of Austria, and Frederick II takes that away from them. Important for a couple of reasons. One is because we do have, some rich farmland down here with the Oder River. We also have some other natural resources that were important for Prussia, but also symbolically important because, again, he's taking it away from Austria. He's taking it away from the Habsburgs. They are the power, remember, because at that point they are ruling the Holy Roman Empire. So taking something away from them is a pretty big statement to not only to the Austrians, but to other people, other German-speaking people as well, that, hey, there's these new kids around and better keep an eye on them because they're pretty serious. Last thing, just looking at this map that I want to point out is just how strange this whole Holy Roman Empire had become by this point. If you look, the purple line shows you the border of the Holy Roman Empire, and again, thanks to the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War that we talked about, all of this land was now chunked up into all these little tiny kingdoms, and some of them are still independent. Some of them by now, as you can see, are starting to be swallowed up by other bigger people. So like the Prussians are starting to spread out and swallow up some of these smaller kingdoms. But even weirder, we have a case like here with Prussia, where the biggest chunk of their lands are inside the Holy Roman Empire, but they're now expanding beyond its borders too. So politically that creates an interesting situation, because the Prussian king technically is under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, but not all of his lands are under the Holy Roman Empire. So again, this is going to create some confusion and some questions of, just how much do we actually have to listen to you, and just how much control do you have over us? So when we get into Austria in the next section, clearly we'll be coming back to that, and we'll be taking a look ahead to see some of the things that end up happening to the Holy Roman Empire. All right, so that's it for our overview of Chapter 16, Section 3. Thank you for listening.